Hello everyone, I'm Shubhadeep Ghosh and today I will be presenting my project exploring the use of LID in learning disentangled and cluster-friendly Latin spaces in autoencoders. Let's look at the problem statement first. It is to explore the various ways in which we can utilize a local intrinsic dimensionality of data in Latin spaces to achieve disentangled or cluster-friendly Latin spaces. Now, what's the need for this? Latent representations encoded by deep neural networks are often an entangled mesh of variations coming from different features. Thus, disentangling is needed. And dimension reduction is a crucial preprocessing step in clustering problems, although the latent spaces produced by such reductions may not be cluster friendly enough. So, the project goal is to investigate both theoretically and empirically the prospect of learning disentangled representations by utilizing LID via total correlation. Then investigating how LID can help form smoother, more separable clusters in the latent space produced by autoencoder. Now, let's look at the uh, let's look at how dimension reduction works and why we need dimension reduction. So most data sets, be it image data set or sensor data set, they are very high dimensional, but the actual data lies on a lower dimensional manifold. What I mean by that is that, say, for image data set, each picture has 784 pixels. That means 784 features. But the original content of the picture is located in very small number of pixels, say around 32 to 50 pixels. So if the lower dimensional manifold here is 32 to 50 dimensions, while the high dimensional space in which the picture actually is 784. So that's a problem because data scientists are plagued by a curse called curse of dimensionality, in which as the number of features grows, the volume of the space grows exponentially. Distances between points become meaningless and the data becomes sparse, and many algorithms degrade in performance or require vastly more samples to generalize. Also, we see that high dimensional measurements often include correlated or irrelevant features. Dimension reduction techniques project onto the most informative directions, filtering out noise and redundancy, which can improve downstream tasks. Humans also can't directly visualize beyond three dimensions. By embedding into two or three dimensions, one can inspect structure, clusters, or manifold in the data directly. Some of the well-known dimension reduction techniques include PCA, which is a linear dimension reduction technique that focuses on finding orthogonal dimensions of maximum variance and then project it onto the top KPCs. Then there is SNE and TSNE, which are nonlinear embedding, preserving local neighborhood probabilities using Gaussian kernel in SNE and student t distribution kernel in TSNE. And then there's the autoencoder, which is a neural network trained to reconstruct input via bottleneck layer. Now let's understand. Now let's look at the problem of entanglement. Say these are the two cars that we have, Tesla Model S and BMW 5 Series. We aim to feed these two cars into our autoencoder and expect the latent space of the autoencoder to produce features such as body shape, headlights, or performance, which can directly be correlated to the structure of the cars, and an inference can be made about which car is constituted by which of these features, and we can directly label them. But in most cases, the latent space is a mixture of these characteristics of the cars. So it's a mix of body shape, headlights, and performance to a certain degree, and vice versa. So none of the latent representations are by themselves being able to tell one feature of the car apart. So this is what we want to achieve by using disentangling. So disentangling makes it easier for us humans to interpret how the model is classifying certain aspects of the data. So by saying, like, as a human, we can say that we can look at a car's body shape, headlights, and performance and say that it is a Tesla Model S or a BMW 5 Series. And we expect our autoencoder to do the same by making it learn disentangled latent representations instead of the entangled mesh of variations it learns from different features. Now let's look at the problem of clustering in latent spaces. So clustering is an unsupervised machine learning technique which is used to group similar unlabeled data points into clusters based on defined similarity measures. Clustering high dimensional data poses several challenges, one of them being the curse of dimensionality, because distances become meaningless at a very high dimension. Then there's the computational cost of processing such high dimensional spaces. So dimension reduction is one of the most important steps performed before clustering as a pre-processing step. However, the learned representations may not inherently be cluster friendly. They aren't guaranteed to align with meaningful or well-separated clusters unless explicitly told to do so. Some of the clustering algorithms that are present in literature are k-means clustering, hierarchical clustering, db-scan, mean shift, and spectral clustering. Now let's look at what an autoencoder is. So autoencoders are neural networks-based dimensionality reduction models that capture nonlinear relationships in the data. An encoder is responsible for compressing the data to latent space, as we can see here. There's a bottleneck dimension that characterizes the latent space, and there's a decoder that decompresses the latent space to the original input data. And the objective is to minimize the reconstruction error from the latent space to the original input again. So by doing this, the autoencoder learns a nonlinear structure in the data and represents it in the latent space. However, as we talked about, the latent space is an entangled mesh of variations, and disentanglement is needed to make it more interpretable. Then there's the concept of total correlation, which is also known as multi-information, and is a generalization of mutual information for measuring dependence among more than two random variables. Total correlation uses entropy as a measure of information contained in a variable. So it is worthwhile to explore the use of intrinsic dimensionality as a proxy for entropy in total correlation and come to a theoretical and practical agreement on whether this approach is fruitful or not. Now let's look at what local intrinsic dimensionality is actually. So intrinsic dimensionality is the minimum number of independent variables required to describe a dataset without loss of its intrinsic structure. The winding curve on the left represents a high-dimensional data space. Zooming in, however, we can see that the data actually lies in a much smaller one-dimensional manifold in a tiny neighborhood. So LID asks the question, how many directions do I actually need locally to move around this point? And we can see that that is 1 in this particular case. So the LID of this data is just 1. So mathematically, LID is the rate at which the neighborhood distribution around a point normalized by the density around the point at a specific distance r is given by this formulation. So IDF of r is the LID of the point, while f dash r is the distribution around the point, and this is the density around the point. So as we tend r towards 0, we get the asymptotic tail distribution, which tells us in how many orthogonal directions we can move around a point. If we can move in just one direction, say up or down, the asymptotic LID around that point becomes 1. Now let's talk about the estimator of LID, which we use in our case, and that is 2 nearest neighbor. 2 nearest neighbor estimator calculates a local intrinsic dimensionality by examining the ratio of distances to the 2 nearest neighbors of each data point. Specifically, it uses the distance to the first and second largest neighbors and nearest neighbors to estimate how data density changes locally around each point. This ratio helps us approximate the intrinsic dimension, capturing local geometry, complexity, and data manifold properties, particularly useful in dimensional reduction and identifying clusters or outliers. Now let's look at weighted k-means clustering, the exact clustering that I utilized in my model to learn cluster-friendly latent spaces. So unlike regular k-means, where cluster centers and cluster assignments are updated just on the basis of distance, weighted k-means assigns weights to points to define the probability of belonging to one cluster over the other. It essentially denotes the cluster membership of a point, and it can help us get the cluster center updates as follows. The idea is to reduce the loss incurred by misassignment of points given by this loss function of the weighted k-means. So as we can see in this image, This blue dot means that this particular point is assigned to this particular cluster with a very high probability as compared to this small point here. And the same for other clusters as well. Now let's look at the theoretical investigation of disentanglement using LID via total correlation. So following the paper, Intrinsic Dimension Correlation, Uncovering Nonlinear Correlations in a Multimodal Representation, I intuitively model total correlation using LID as a proxy for entropy as follows. However, the correctness of this naive formulation is subject to question. Total correlation is defined over the full data distribution, whereas LID characterizes behavior in the lower distributional tail. For theoretical investigation, we have to study the behavior of TC in the limit where the neighborhood radius reaches 0. So in this slide, I have explored theoretically what happens to TC as the neighborhood radius reaches 0. I have taken help and guidance from the paper Local Intrinsic Dimensionality, Entropy and Statistical Divergences by J. Bailey, M. Howell, and X. Ma. So first, I broke down total correlation into the formulation using entropies. Then I expanded the entropies using the tail entropy formula. And then using the help of the paper, I expanded the latent spaces. So here Zi means the latent space, latent feature 1, whereas Z itself means the entire latent space. So we do the sum of latent features, and here we take the LID of the entire of the entropy of the entire latent space. So as we go down the equation and derive, we finally reach this point where we can clearly see that when W reaches 0, this formulation diverges. So there is no definition of TC in terms of LID because TC diverges as neighborhood radius tends to 0. Thus, our assumption is wrong and not theoretically sound. But for the sake of exploration and investigation, I still went on to implement this knife formula and observe what results we can get, which I will discuss in the results section. Now coming to learning cluster-friendly latent spaces. To ensure that autoencoder learns a latent space that facilitates clustering, several modifications were introduced to the baseline architecture. So during model training, weighted k-means clustering was directly applied to the latent space, whose loss gave us the first additional loss, the k-means loss, as seen here. The weights were assigned using the softmax function. The weights were assigned using the softmax function such that it gives us the similarity measured between a point and its corresponding centroid. Therefore, the closer the point is, the higher the weight is, as we can see here. Next, to make sure similar points are clustered together and dissimilar points are as far apart as possible, KL divergence loss function is introduced in models like TSNE, SED cluster, or SCZI-DESC. So how this works is that first a probability distribution of every point Zi belonging to the same cluster as other points in the latent space is built using T distribution kernel as follows. Specifically, T distribution kernel is used because it allows us to control the degrees of freedom a point has, which essentially gives us the distribution related to a point heavier tails than that of Gaussian distribution. Why we need heavier tails associated to a points distribution, we will come to that later. So here is an auxiliary distribution, target distribution, which is defined as follows. So the auxiliary target distribution has sharper tails and more prominent peaks than the original T distribution. Now, when we try to push or pull the original distribution towards the target distribution, we tend to pull flatten the heavier tails of the original distribution and make it closer to the target distribution, which penalizes moderate distances and makes sure that points that have lower similarity to each other and have been assigned moderate probabilities of not being together is punished heavily, and they are as far apart as possible, while those that are pretty close together are brought even closer together. So the core objective becomes aligning the distribution PJI with the target distribution QJI, and thereby compressing the heavy tails and producing more pronounced peaks. This distribution transformation effectively brings similar data points closer together and pushes dissimilar points further apart, enhancing cluster separation in latent space. Finally, I introduce the Itakura Saito divergence using LIDs of distributions QJ and PJI as is introduced as follows. So why choose this loss? What does this loss do? This loss essentially models that what this loss essentially model is that how many degrees of freedom does a point in distribution P have relative to that of a point Q? On data whose neighborhood sizes vary roughly, the KL term can over-tighten dense regions and neglect sparse ones. An LID term counterbalances that by pushing sparse zones to contract as well. Low LID means that data is more tightly packed and hence there is less room for adversaries. Just optimizing P and Q leads to large clusters swallowing the smaller ones. Keeping LID low everywhere will make sure the bigger clusters do not cover the smaller ones. We have all these theoretical guarantees for using Itakura Saito divergence laws, but the practical viability is yet to be explored, which I will do in the next few slides. So this is how I introduce all the new losses to my to my autoencoder model to learn cluster-friendly latent spaces. Next is the 2NN estimator. Here we can estimate IDs using 2NN estimator, as was discussed in background. So briefly summarizing how it works is that the estimator operates by first computing the ratio between the distances to the second and first nearest neighbors of each point, which is then transformed using an inverse logarithmic scale. Subsequently, it evaluates the cumulative distributive function of these values relative to each point. A line is then fitted through the origin using the inverse log scale ratios as the coordinates, as the x coordinates, and the corresponding CDF values as the y coordinates. The slope of this line provides the estimated LID of the data. The use of only two nearest neighbors renders the estimator highly efficient and free of tunable parameters. Now let's look at the code for this 2NN estimator. Here I briefly introduce the codes I made for most of my models, and this is the LID estimator. As I said that it first estimates the two nearest neighbor distances, then finds their ratio in the inverse logarithmic scale, as we can see here. Then it uses something, so this is the inverse logarithmic ratio. Then it uses something called tot sort, which is essentially a continuous sorting instead of discrete sorting. So this allows backpropagation because discrete sorting won't allow backpropagation. Continuous sorting allows backpropagation. And using that sorting, we can get this CDF. It evaluates the cumulative distributive function of these values relative to each point, and that is taken as the y value. And then we finally compute the slope using this formulation of linear regression. Yeah, and that is how the slope is calculated and returned for the LID estimator. And this is pretty accurate, even for high dimensional data sets, as compared to MLE or method of moments where there is a need to be dependent on other distances, like we have to depend on number of neighbors. Here, the number of neighbors is fixed, just two, but it's still very highly accurate. And then let's look at the autoencoder. So this is the autoencoder. It has two hidden dimensions. Hidden dimension 1, hidden dimension 2. The input layer is 784 following the MNIST dataset feature size, and the bottleneck dimension has 32 dimensions. So this is the important part. Here I calculate the t distribution using the cal latent, and then from the t distribution the auxiliary target distribution is also calculated, and here the k-means clustering loss is like the distances for the k-means clustering is computed, and the k-means loss is computed here. This is the reconstruction loss. So we got the two distributions here, and using the LID estimator that I showed before, we can compute the LIDs of these two distributions. We also find the K loss directly from these distributions as shown here. And then we also compute the Itakura Saito divergence loss. So here we see that we are using a combination of reconstruction loss, K-means loss, KL loss, and Itakura Saito divergence loss. So before the model is trained on these losses, they are first trained for a few iterations to obtain the initial latent representations before we start doing k-means clustering. This is like a warm start, gives a warm start. So there is this concept of self-training. So when self-training is lost, the total loss is just the reconstruction loss. But when self-training is on, then there is the k-means loss added, the k loss added, and the integral divergence loss added. The rest of this is just defining the training loop, and that's about it. Now let's look at the experimental setup and datasets used for these experiments. A simple autoencoder architecture was developed as I showed in the codes before, and the network weights were optimized using the Atom optimizer. Training was conducted utilizing NVIDIA A100 GPU. However, CPU-based training is also feasible with the exception of one PyTorch library called TorchSword requiring CUDA support to download or install in the system. And all the source code and datasets are available in the GitHub. So now let's look at disentanglement using LID via total correlation. As I already established using my theoretical proof that this cannot be done. However, I still went ahead and implemented it for exploration's sake. And here I used MNIST dataset, which has where each image has 784 dimensional vector input vector and passed through an autoencoder with a bottleneck dimension of 10. In an ideally disentangled representation, each latent dimension would independently capture information pertinent to a single digit class. However, as we can see, most latent features disproportionately capture information associated to digit 1, while exhibiting low information with other labels. Moreover, the uniformity of rows in the mutual information matrix suggests that the latent features are functioning similarly, indicating an absence of feature specialization or disentanglement. This observation is reinforced in figure 1b, which reveals that latent features shares an approximately equal amount of information with label 0, further confirming the lack of disentanglement in the learned representation. Now let's look at learning cluster-friendly latent spaces using LID. So before we do that, we have to first establish some baseline. And here I used PCA plus k-means as a baseline for clustering on dimension reduced latent spaces. As we can see, the latent spaces have PT diffused clusters, and they are not very separable as such. So anything on this will be an improvement, and let's see that. So as we can see, the results are produced by the model that uses only the IS loss along with the reconstruction and k-means loss. no KL divergence loss was used in the processing of these inputs. So as we can see in the cover type and diabetes cover type and ship performance datasets, the model performed very strongly, pulling apart each cluster away from each other, and all the point assignments are done very well. Uh, in diabetes and market campaign datasets, the model has performed satisfactorily, while in the MNIST dataset, it has performed better than the baseline, as we can see. Also, in the MNIST dataset, the model could not be converged to 3 dimensions, because then it is incurring a huge reconstruction loss. This is mainly due to the autoencoder not being too deep. It is a very shallow autoencoder. So if I make the autoencoder structure even further deep, then the reconstruction loss will not be so high for reducing it to such a small dimension. But as of now, I have trained it to a bottleneck dimension of 32. So the latent space has 32 dimensions, and that has been projected to a 2D space using TSNE plot. As we can see, even after doing that, the latent space is pretty separable, and the clusters have been formed good. Finally, we look at the Itakura Saito divergence loss with the Kale divergence loss, along with the reconstruction and k-mean losses. And here we can see the cover type dataset. In the cover type dataset, while the clusters are well defined, the Itakura Saito divergence loss overly tightened some of the clusters here while pushing apart the other clusters. This is mainly due to the fact that probably these data points have very similar features, which brought them together near each other, and the Itakura Saito divergence does just compress them together. As for the diabetes dataset, we see that there's a performance failure here. This is mainly due to the fact that diabetes dataset has very small number of data points, only 150 around. And in such scenarios, the Itakura Saito divergence loss receives noisy and unstable targets, resulting in high variance gradients and that overwhelm the Kale divergence signal and destabilize the training. For the marketing campaign and ship performance dataset, it performed well enough comparable to the just using Itakura Saito divergence loss. And in the MNIST and fashion MNIST, we can clearly see the latent spaces being cluster friendly, the clusters being highly separable, and yeah, the performance has been good and much better than the just using the baseline of PCA plus k-means. With this, I come to the limitations and future work. So as we can see that LID can still be used for disentanglement. In an ideally disentangled latent space, one expects that the global intrinsic dimensionality to match the number of latent factors, while the local ID should approximate 1. When two or more latent coordinates are entangled, movement along one axis influences the other, resulting in a local ID greater than 1. This behavior may still be leveraged in some other metric other than total correlation, which is radius stable and can be formulated, where the local radius tends to 0. And then there's the multimodal disentanglement, where independent encoders and decoders can map the input to one shared latent space, letting models align visual regions with text for better interpretability and reasoning. Then there's the limitations of LID estimation. As we see in datasets that have very small number of samples, like in the diabetes dataset or high dimensional datasets, the 2NN and MLE LID estimates become numerically unstable. A single global LID becomes inadequate for data on multiple or nested manifolds. So LID should not be optimized as a loss term in all these cases. And finally, we see that how we can do post hoc cluster refinement. So in most of these methods explored in the report, we did not directly influence cluster membership assignments, but rather served to define the geometry of clusters that had already been formed using the Itakura Saito divergence loss. The principle of post hoc cluster refinement can be applied to other clustering algorithms to yield tighter, smoother, and more separable clusters, thereby enhancing cluster quality without altering initial level assignments. So in this report, We explored how intrinsic dimensionality cannot be used with total correlation to learn latent representation, both theoretically and empirically. We also empirically investigated uh, how cluster-friendly Latin spaces could be learned leveraging Itakura Saito divergence and Kalbat-Lever divergence, one in place of the other or both together. Using both of them together is produces more robust and compact results, I would say. And then finally, we looked at the challenges to the current formulations, and further studies should focus on robust dimensionality estimation methods, multimodal data integration, and further refinement of clustering methods to exploit the capabilities of Latin representation learning. These are some of the resources that I used. Most of the images were taken from these sites, and some of them were generated using ChatGPT, while one is taken from Professor Michael Howell's lecture notes. All the other images were generated by my models, and the code for those models and all the datasets are present in my GitHub repository, as the link is given here. So please feel free to ask any questions if you have, and that's it. Thank you.